This week we have gone through what I would say a successful, we haven't finished yet, but I have already decided it's been a successful a successful time where we've discussed, we've digested, we've analyzed, we've tried to bring up solutions to the theme. We've discussed two main sub-themes on panels, workshop groups, women and leadership in trade unions, of course, equitable education for an equitable world. So now we're getting to the stage where I think the most important stage, as we look at our theme when we're talking about words to actions. So today we're going to wrap up everything that we have said, we have discussed, we have thrown forward as solutions over the past 2 days. So this morning, we're going to start with a panel, and the moderator will be Yamil Sokolovsky, who is the director of the Federation of Higher Education Teachers, CONADU in Argentina. So Yamil, you're welcome to take your seat. She will be supported by Lily Escalén Garcia, the Vice President of the National Education Association of the USA. Lily. Milagros Ogalinda, General Secretary of the National Alliance of Teachers and Office Workers from the Philippines. Milagros. And then Diane Walsh, from President of the Canadian Teachers Federation. So they have the tough job of telling us what actions we can put to our words. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Let us be very good. Let us give them a good hearing and support them. So, Madam Moderator, I think I should have brought the tuku-tuku. You are in charge.
Pero no tengo el tucu-tucu. Toco. Bueno, buenos días, compañeras, los compañeros presentes también. Es un honor poder estar coordinando este panel con las compañeras. Hoy que vamos a hablar en nuestra última jornada de acciones, como vamos a hablar de acciones, entonces quería, para comenzar, hacer una pequeña reflexión sobre las palabras, porque está claro que lo que queremos es actuar, lo que queremos es no solamente hablar de nuestros dolores, hablar de nuestros sueños, hablar del mundo que tenemos y hablar del mundo que queremos, sino también queremos cambiar el mundo. Pero también es cierto que las palabras son fundamentales en la acción política y sindical. Las palabras forman parte de la acción política y sindical. Y la palabra particularmente tiene potencia transformadora cuando esa palabra expresa vivencias, expresa memorias, expresa deseos, y por lo tanto cuando es una palabra representativa, es una palabra significativa y es una palabra movilizadora. Nosotras necesitamos esa palabra para cambiar el mundo, esa palabra que usamos para definir con claridad nuestros objetivos y nuestras estrategias y que nos obliga también a hacer un análisis cada vez más claro, cada vez más lúcido de la situación en la que nos encontramos y de los distintos niveles en los que queremos actuar. Y esa palabra que necesitamos además para reconocer nuestras dificultades y para reconocer la multiplicidad de factores que configuran y que reproducen la situación de las mujeres como una situación subalterna que nosotros queremos modificar en la sociedad, en la educación y en los sindicatos. y es una palabra que además necesitamos para poder convocar a otras y a otros a trabajar, a luchar juntos y juntas por objetivos comunes. La palabra, cuando es una palabra crítica, también es una fuerza transformadora. Y así queremos que sea nuestra palabra. Y en estos días estuvimos usando palabras, estuvimos hablando mucho sobre las transformaciones que queremos producir, estuvimos tratando de identificar los distintos planos donde nosotras tenemos que actuar para producir esas transformaciones, sobre las políticas públicas, sobre los marcos legales, los marcos normativos donde se desarrolla nuestra vida, sobre los marcos normativos y las políticas públicas que determinan nuestras condiciones de trabajo, que determinan las políticas del cuidado, que definen los márgenes para la protección de derechos de las trabajadoras, de derechos de las niñas, de derechos de las mujeres en la educación y también y sobre todo de los marcos normativos y de las políticas que se desarrollan en nuestros sindicatos. Estuvimos hablando de las cuotas, de los espacios de mujeres, de las políticas de formación y de la transversalidad de la política de género, de la importancia de que la política de género atraviese integralmente la política de nuestros sindicatos y además de la importancia de que nosotras, mujeres, estemos involucradas en todos los aspectos de las políticas de nuestros sindicatos y sobre todo en aquellos aspectos que son más decisivos para definir el perfil y la capacidad de acción de nuestros sindicatos. Y hemos discutido mucho, además, sobre algo muy importante y muy difícil, que es la necesidad de transformar la cultura política de nuestros sindicatos y las prácticas de nuestros sindicatos. Esas cuestiones que tienen que ver con la posibilidad de democratizar la vida de nuestras organizaciones y, por lo tanto, de tornarlas más representativas y, por lo tanto, más fuertes. Ahora, no se trata solo de decir qué hay que hacer, sino también tenemos que seguir avanzando, tenemos que seguir reflexionando y hablando sobre cómo hay que hacerlo y con quiénes hay que hacerlo. Entonces, hoy vamos a conversar con las compañeras aquí presentes sobre algunos de los aspectos que hacen a esta red, a este espacio en el que nos tenemos que mover con nuestras organizaciones para poder efectivamente producir esas transformaciones y más allá de la palabra, pero con la palabra, cambiar este mundo en el que nosotros denunciamos la desigualdad y queremos la justicia. Entonces, les voy a ir presentando una por una a nuestras compañeras. Mi primera pregunta va a ir dirigida a Lili. Ahora las voy a presentar a todas. Lili Eskelsen García comenzó su carrera en la enseñanza como encargada de comedor, se convirtió en auxiliar de guardería y el profesor la animó a ir a la universidad y se graduó como profesora en el estado de Utah. Ha trabajado como presidenta de la Utah Education Association, presidenta del Utah State Retirement System, presidenta de la Children at Risk Foundation. El presidente Obama la nombró comisaria de la Comisión sobre la Excelencia Educativa de los Hispanos de la Casa Blanca. En su blog, Lily's Blackboard, la señora Eskelsen, Lili, comenta sobre temas educativos de actualidad. Sus opiniones han sido publicadas en la revista Parenting y otros medios de comunicación. Tenemos con nosotros también a Milagros Ogalinda. Milagros ha ejercido la docencia en Filipinas por más de 20 años y es la secretaria general de la Samahan Manggagawa Filipino National Alliance of Teachers and Office Workers. En la 7ª Conferencia Regional Asia-Pacífico de la Internacional de la Educación fue elegida miembro del Comité para el Sureste de Asia. Milagros ha sido presidenta del José Rizal University Faculty and Employees Union y vicepresidenta del Trade Union Congress of the Philippines y también es coordinadora de las afiliadas de la Internacional de la Educación en Filipinas en la red de mujeres. Es una entusiasta docente, ha participado y encabezado varias iniciativas de presión en un esfuerzo por eliminar la discriminación contra las niñas y las mujeres en general, tanto a nivel local como nacional. Y finalmente la compañera Diane Woloschuk es presidenta de la Canadian Teachers Federation desde 2013 y miembro del Consejo de la Dirección de la Canadian Teachers Federation desde 2007. Presidió el Federation's Advisory Committee on Aboriginal Education durante 2 años y ha presidido y trabajado en el comité financiero de la Canadian Teachers Federation. Diane también fue presidenta de la Saskatchewan Teachers Federation desde 2007 hasta 2010, donde se centró principalmente en la profesionalidad, la gobernanza y la defensa y trabajó varios años en la dirección de la Saskatoon Teachers Association y anteriormente fue docente con más de 35 años de experiencia en los sistemas escolares de zonas rurales y urbanas de Saskatchewan. Si es así, entonces les damos la bienvenida y vamos a comenzar con el diálogo. Quería preguntarte, para comenzar, Lili, ¿cómo se plantea en la acción sindical la relación con los responsables de política pública? Esta es una relación que a veces es colaborativa, a veces es confrontativa, pero ¿qué importancia tiene plantearse esa relación desde los sindicatos para lograr cambios, los cambios que nos estamos planteando?
Pensé tener esta presentación en español, pero la verdad es que mi español es muy mal. Y quiero entender lo que estoy diciendo y tal vez mejor continuar en inglés, pero este es mi esfuerzo. Okay. This question that we have of working within the political structures and political policy. In the United States, we have a history of moving from injustice towards something better, but we move very slowly. We still live in a world where to be born a woman, to be born a little girl, is a disadvantage in your opportunities. And when we look at what we have achieved in terms of helping girls and women achieve their potential, we see laws against discrimination, we see affirmative action where at times women are given the opportunity for a scholarship, where companies and organizations are encouraged to take a look at the balance, the gender balance amongst their employees. And we still continue to do a lot of research on gender equity. But as we were talking, and as Jatmil has said about, the word transformation keeps coming up. We keep moving, we keep trying to transform from what we are into something better. And it occurs to me that in my own union, the National Education Association, we have worked so hard to transform our culture, to transform our union, to transform our structure. It occurs to me that you can't transform an organization. You can't transform a culture. You can only transform people, individuals. An individual heart can transform. You can restructure your organization and say we will have 50% women and 50% men on a committee, on a board. But if the 50% men still act the way they were acting, if the 50% women still act the way they were acting, then you haven't transformed anything. You've just changed the chairs and rearranged the furniture. And so I look at what we have to do to convince political powers, to convince our own colleagues. And it's more than passing a motion or passing a law. We really have to find ways to transform who we are inside and how we look at our work. I was watching, I don't know if you know what a TED Talk is, little 20-minute speeches on the internet. And a friend of mine just last week sent me a TED Talk when I told her I was coming here. And it was something called the imposter syndrome. And I had never heard of that before. But there have been studies done where they have studied accomplished women, women in business, in law, in medicine, in research, I would think in a room like this, there would be many accomplished women. And what they found out was a preponderance of women who are very accomplished do not believe they got there on their own efforts. It was luck. It was, well, I was in the right place at the right time. They believe they are imposters. They believe they don't deserve where they are. I look at all that we're working with in terms of government policies and our own policies within our own unions and our organizations to strive towards gender equality. If we end up with women like ourselves who feel that no matter what we accomplish, no matter what the evidence of our success, that somewhere in our hearts we feel like we don't deserve to be there, that people will see us and go, what if they find out I don't really know what I'm doing? I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands and say, have you ever felt like someone was going to find out that you don't really know everything you need to know? Men will sometimes feel this, but a very small percentage of men. Women, the majority of women feel this. Think about the women in this room. None of us are here because someone just drew our name out of a hat and we won a lottery. We won a prize to come to Ireland. You are something in your organization. You are something powerful and important in your organization, or you would not have been given an invitation to come here. And if it's true that so many of us, when we have reached some level of accomplishment, feel that we really didn't deserve it, that someone else could have done a better job. We're unusual because we overcame that feeling to run for an office, to ask for a job that was important. Think of all of our sisters who couldn't overcome that feeling, that they didn't belong, that they weren't good enough, that someone else could do a better job. They couldn't overcome that feeling, and that their barrier existed inside of them. It wasn't a law. It wasn't someone saying you can't run for an office, you won't be hired for this job. They stopped themselves. So as we talk about the importance of all the things that we need to change in our laws, in our structures, that is important. It is not sufficient. It is not enough. On a parallel track, we have to also be talking about how do we build that confidence in ourselves to say we are worthy. We are people who have something to give. It has to come together. And one of the things that I want to do whenever I go to a conference like this, and we talk about what our organizations can do, I want to always take it to one step higher, and I believe it is higher. In my mind, I want to say, and what is my personal responsibility? I have a circle of influence. I have friends. I have people who count on me and look to me as a role model. I have other people who I look to as a role model. And I want to always use that circle of influence of individuals. And I want to talk about what we've talked about here. So I want us all to think about what we can do internally and what we can do with our sisters and brothers in helping build that culture, that change, that restructuring from within. All of the policies will come from that. Until we deal with what's inside, nothing will change.
Gracias, Lili. Bueno, creo que seguramente en la posibilidad de generar situaciones que permitan a las mujeres ganar confianza respecto de lo que podemos y de que efectivamente podemos hacer mucho más. Las redes de mujeres juegan un papel fundamental. Le quería pedir a Milagros que hagamos una consideración sobre la importancia que tienen el trabajo de las organizaciones sindicales con el conjunto del movimiento de mujeres, con el movimiento social por la igualdad de género y en particular con las redes, con las propias redes constituidas en la Internacional de la Educación en las distintas regiones.
Yeah. Muchas gracias. That's the only. Indeed, the mantra words, from words to actions, really define or describe what we are to do as leaders in our own respective unions. And I do believe that the ASEAN Women's Network is really doing its best based on the guidelines of the Gender Equality Action Plan, which we discussed and very much emphasized in the last World Women's Congress. I remember it was emphasized that there is a need for us to combine or to use as a strategy the gender mainstreaming in the policy in order to get the gender equality cause or realization in our trade unions and in the trade union movement. I should say that we are also anchored on the saying or in the principle that we cannot do it alone. The Philippines is very lucky to have with us Education International and other development partners, in pursuing our cause. We were very lucky to have Larar Porbondet, the Swedish Teachers Union, in pushing us to the wall. I should say that because there should be some actions. So we were able to institutionalize some policies in our own union and some mechanisms in place. Very much important, and I am very, very much proud to say that in the Philippines there is the Magna Carta of Women, a very comprehensive law on women, wherein the 4 affiliates in EI, in the Philippines, work hand in hand. It was really a shared responsibility and effort and a recognition that this particular law was enacted. Actually, we're just pushing for the ratification of ILO Convention on Maternity Protection, but the government gave us a more comprehensive one, incorporating the things or the provisions that we want to achieve. So that is what the network is doing in the Philippines. I should also say that very important, the tripartite scheme, wherein it involves the union, the management, and even the government, wherein all issues, not all issues, but some of the issues pertaining to women are deliberated, and we are happy that we are a part of it. So we can knock the door of the executive branches and the legislative branches of the government, and we can say that our concerns are incorporated in that particular law. The 4 EI affiliates in the Philippines, the ACT, the FFW, and TAPS, are very proud to say that we have some outputs because of this networking. We acted on the issue on migration, and we came up with a paper, an output, why teachers are leaving in the Philippines. But of course, we all know some of the reasons, but the government will not just accept it as it is when we are just when we are just talking about it without any concrete evidence that these are the results of our effort in coming up with an evidence that teachers are really going out of the country because you are not giving them a fair treatment. And with the gender equality in mind, we also had this activity wherein we review some books that are not friendly, that contain gender biases. And the output in that particular effort is now in the hands of the government agencies. Of course, the lifeblood of the union, we could say that there are negotiated provisions that are gender issues, like for example, the breastfeeding, increase in maternity leaves, and flexible arrangement in terms of a woman who is pregnant, flexible time arrangement, nursing room for lactating mother. Those are the things that, of course, they are just simple achievements, but those achievements are a result of cooperation among the teachers in the country. I should also must say that there is already an institutionalization of the 30% quota for women leaders at all levels of leadership, but of course we don't want the 30% because I learned that many of us here have this 50% or even 100% so that we can change the world. We can change the trade union movement, we can change the education, and of course, everybody must be on board. I always think about it. We cannot do this alone. Education is our concern. It is everybody's concern, and therefore, we need each other, especially the network of teachers who are really, really working hard. And the Philippines, I should say, and the ASEAN, very, very lucky to have our experts here who are really helping us to not just to stand to wait for the help, but also to work on our own so that later on we will be sustainable. We can do it on our own. That's it.
Muy bien, gracias Milagros. Es clara la importancia que tienen las redes para darle un marco más amplio a la pelea por la igualdad en el espacio político concreto que representan nuestras regiones políticas y geográficas, y también las redes como aquellas estructuras que nos permiten articular a nivel global esta pelea, ¿no? y referir esa pelea a las realidades locales, y también las redes como el espacio donde, como Milagros relataba, también es posible no solamente hacer planteos concretos a los poderes públicos, sino también desarrollar un trabajo conjunto con la comunidad y con otras organizaciones que tienen objetivos comunes con el nuestro. Creo que así como es importante pensar el nivel de articulación de acciones y de luchas, también es importante pensar cómo la problemática de género se articula con otras problemáticas que también expresan situaciones de inequidad, situaciones de desigualdad, de falta de reconocimiento de derechos, y en ese sentido queríamos preguntarle a Dayan cómo se articulan las distintas categorías, lo que se ha dado en llamar las categorías de la diferencia, que también podríamos pensar como categorías que expresan distintas formas de la exclusión y de la opresión y de la falta de reconocimiento, pero cómo se da esa articulación en la práctica concreta en el aula.
Oh, thank you. When we speak about education and we speak about teaching, we're really talking about what is going on in the classroom every day, that relationship between teachers and learners. And I think it's the most important consideration initially is to remember how we frame that in terms of human rights. The impetus to provide free compulsory education to all children is one that's not based in research, as educational change often is, or in particular practices or that sort of thing. It really has come about in multiple kinds of ways through the Declaration, the Universal Declaration on the Rights of the Child, court cases like the Brown versus Board of Education case in the United States, or the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada, where it's been very, very clearly articulated that this is a human rights issue. It's not optional, and governments throughout the world need to be aware of their responsibilities with respect to that obligation to meet the human rights of these children and young people. Part of our task and our mission, our great mission as unions and union leaders, is to remind them of that and to advocate daily for those rights to be respected and honored. In that sense, then, it's so important, and I know we all work on this, to ensure that the policy base on which we're operating is reflective of those human rights of children. And where those policies are lacking, where we don't have those kinds of authorities, then we need to continue to pressure government to address these, and to address them in concrete ways. Issues of poverty, which we know affects accessibility, ability to learn, and all of those sorts of things. Inequality, discrimination, and more broadly, economic kinds of policies, like policies on progressive taxation, which are important in order for governments to be able to support a well-resourced school system and to be able to pay teachers appropriately for the work that they do and provide other types of supports to their work. The value we want to realize is equality. The means for achieving it is equity. And I find it interesting that you won't find very many people who will argue with the principle that all children deserve to be educated and not have to pay for it. Very few people will argue with that. Where you run into difficulty, where you can run into challenges is when we start talking about each child. This child in front of me. What does it mean to educate this child in a way that meets the needs of this child? And this is where we start often to see governments backpedaling. And we hear about, oh, we don't have enough money for these resources, or we don't have this, we don't have that, we can't meet this. And yet that is where the promise of that human right is realized in how we deal with each and every child. And we must continue to insist on this with governments, that they have the responsibility to provide for that, and that shouldn't be any kind of fleeing from that because of a question of resources. Promoting equity means understanding, valuing, and responding to diversity and difference throughout the school and throughout the community. It's the recognition that different children have different needs. It's not about sameness, it's about responsiveness. How do we respond to these children? Mary Metcalf mentioned yesterday in her remarks that, that struggle is not everywhere the same, that context is important. And the same thing applies with schools and trying to ensure that we're meeting the needs of children in their schools. We need a really highly contextual approach. What are the needs of this community? What are the needs of this school? And ultimately, what are the needs of this child? And how can I, as a teacher, how can we as a school respond to those needs in such a way that we create equitable learning conditions for that child's learning? And that means we need to listen. Mary mentioned that yesterday. We need to listen and we need to respond. When I think about putting these principles of equity into action, when I was thinking about it, I decided to really approach it from the point of view of those 3 pillars of the Unite campaign. We've heard a lot about them now for a year. Many of us have done a lot of work on making those pillars well known in our communities and influencing government with them. But I'd just like to take a few minutes to talk about that. With this high context approach, ensuring that we're understanding our communities and our kids, we need to have quality tools, an inclusive, culturally appropriate, diverse curriculum. Often we have lots of policy about diversity. I know in Canada, in my own organization, we had policies about Aboriginal education 20 years before the government and teachers together acted to incorporate Aboriginal ways of knowing and treaty education and all of that into the curriculum. It's integrated throughout the curriculum. I don't care which subject you're studying, you're going to see those ways of knowing reflected in how that subject is taught and what the children are learning. We need to look for opportunities to do that, and frankly, I think we need to lead the way on it. We need to push. Governments won't necessarily come forward with that on their own. In terms of resources, again, we need to remind government of their obligation to fund, not let them off the hook, and at the same time look to see what are the resources within the community that we can use. Where are the partnerships and the networks that we've already mentioned that we can use to work on that? In terms of quality learning environments, I've already heard quite a bit at this conference about the need to ensure that schools are equipped with what's needed so that every child feels welcome and comfortable and safe there. Something we need to do. Local schools need to be inclusive schools, and the principle of a child being able to attend their local school is an important one for us to emphasize. When I think about learning environments, I think that you can't talk about that without talking about how teachers work with kids. That's probably the biggest part of that learning environment. The opportunity for kids to belong is a key one. There needs to be room, space, somewhere for kids to belong, every child to belong in every school. And there are certainly strategies that teachers can use: constructivist pedagogy, inquiry learning, formative assessment, that really supports the learning of every child. And I'd like to make the point, because we hear so much about standardized testing, and governments tend to be so keen on it, that when you have a diverse population of students, the more diverse that population is, the less useful standardized testing is going to be. For students with diverse needs, obliging them to write this test, it'll help you to know a few things about what they don't know, but it doesn't allow the students to show you what they do know. And that's what's important. What do they know? It's not the test, it's what the kids have learned that really matters. So we talk about differentiated instruction. We want students to be engaged in their own learning. We want to establish problem-solving, collaborative school cultures. We've heard a lot about collaboration here again. I think it's very important for teachers to work together, to mentor one another, to share resources and strategies in their schools. And one of the key parts of a safe school and inclusive and learning environment is those respectful, accepting school cultures. Challenging the stereotypes. I think as teachers that's something we need to do every day. Whenever we hear it, whenever we see that happening, we need to challenge it. And not just with students or parents, but with our own colleagues if need be. And I'd like to talk also about professional development and the need for teacher education programs to be solid, well-developed, and the need for that professional development to continue. This is something that unions work a great deal upon. There's international cooperation around this area. Collaborative team approaches and mentorship, as I've mentioned, specific training geared to student needs, and pedagogy. These are all very important. And I think as unions, we need to be very clear about what our role is in that is one of the key things that we do. I'd also like to emphasize that as teachers, as individual teachers, one of the key things is reflecting on our own practice. And frankly, I think reflecting on our own assumptions about things. Lily mentioned earlier, what do we tend to assume about ourselves as leaders? I think we also need to examine what are we modeling for our students then through our behavior. What are we modeling in what we say and what we do? Because it all matters. Kids pick up on those things. They know right away what kinds of messages that we're giving. I think it's important basically also for us to talk about and pay attention to the needs of parents, immigrant parents, parents of at-risk students, parents in poor communities who don't have a lot of resources, paying attention to the power differentials that exist there. It's often intimidating for parents to deal with the school because they just don't feel that they're on an equal footing. And the importance for students to feel respected, capable, to emphasize their abilities, to have high expectations, and to create support networks that can help them to realize their potential.
Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias, Diane. Bueno, creo que es evidente que es una tarea compleja pero es necesario pensar en articular todos estos niveles. Estamos pensando en nuestra acción a nivel de los individuos, pero también necesariamente a nivel colectivo y a nivel de las estructuras en las que trabajamos y en las que se desarrolla nuestra actividad y las estructuras que condicionan la dinámica del funcionamiento de la sociedad. Y también estamos pensando necesariamente en la articulación de un nivel global, un nivel regional y el nivel nacional, que es donde finalmente se resuelven la base de las políticas que intentamos transformar o sobre las que intentamos incidir. Y en ese sentido es importante pensar también a la hora de precisar el rumbo de nuestra acción, la articulación necesaria entre los sindicatos nacionales y la Internacional de la Educación. Entonces, lo que les voy a pedir ahora a las compañeras es que ellas nos comenten cómo piensan que debería desarrollarse esta articulación entre la Internacional de la Educación y el nivel nacional, como para efectivamente lograr llevar adelante nuestra agenda de cambios. Lili.
Okay. I guess I always try to make a point in something like diversity where people who are cynical may say, you're trying to be politically correct. And when they say politically correct, they mean you just want to tinker with the edges, you want to say the right words to seem proper, but they mean it in a very cynical way. I always find it very powerful to make the case to, say, a politician in terms of cold, hard evidence. And there's nothing colder than business, than a corporation. It is cold, hard business evidence that a recent study showed that as a corporate board achieved closer and closer to 50% women and men on a corporate board, their profits went up. I think that some people would be surprised to hear that and have you make the case as an education union that you were using something from the corporate world. They've done studies and they said when you increase the number of women in places where it has traditionally been all men, they come up with different ideas. They come up with more diverse ideas. They come up with things that the men would have never thought of all by themselves. And so when you go out there and you start to speak to outside groups, if Education International had in its possession that kind of research, that kind of evidence that they could share with the rest of us to help us make that case to the politicians and foundations and all of the entities that impact our work, I think they start to listen to us in a different way. There is some very surprising evidence out there in the corporate world that is not cynical. It is not simply politically correct. It shows that you increase and improve your productivity, your creativity, the ideas that your organization is developing. And as you go out there and say, that's what we want for education, that's what's going to drive our national economies, when we increase the skills and the inclusion of girls and women in our society. We don't have to go on bended knees saying, this is a charitable contribution. We can go there and say, this is essential to our economy, to our culture, to our future. And we ignore girls and women and their contributions to our natural, or to our national peril. Education International is such a wealth of information about good practices in education and good practices in unions. I think if we could expand that to simply say, and what are the best practices and research, even apart from what we usually take a look at, I think we'd be surprised how much from the corporate world we can use and share internationally. Thank you.
Gracias. Milagros, ¿quieres hacer un comentario?
Okay. Yeah, given the distance of the national unions with the global federations, I believe that EI leadership is serving as a bridge or a nucleus wherein I should say all efforts are gearing towards one direction. And to the countries like Philippines, it is very important for us to have something to look up to that could really push the issues globally while we are doing it nationally. And so many efforts, or so many, I should say, efforts that are now done but in the international arena, that national unions are benefiting out of that scheme, or I should say effort. Now, EI should I say, should continue to its effort to bridge the gap, to continue the so-called cross-regional cooperations of the different women's network in the EI family, because it is really very helpful, very, very meaningful, very relevant, especially nowadays that we are living in a very hostile condition.
Gracias, Milagros. Diane.
Well, thank you. As I was thinking about this whole work on equality for women, and I was thinking about the work of EI and our experience of that work, I kept thinking about how the two of those are really, how they come together. And there was an image that came to mind for me about how for millennia, it's women who have really kept the fire burning in their families, in their communities. They've tended the hearth, they've created that special place of warmth and light. And they've worked, often in a very hidden kind of way, to create a life for their families and for their communities. And as I thought about this whole piece of keeping the fires burning, there were some images that came to mind for me that make sense to me about what the work of EI is like. And so I'd like to share a few images with you that are based on this and see where that takes us. The first one I'd like to talk about is the image of a campfire. It seems to me like EI is a lot like a campfire that's burning. I don't know if you've ever been out there in the evening, you know, the stars overhead. People gather around the campfire, and one of the really neat things about campfires is that the more people come, the circle just keeps getting bigger. And to me, EI is one of these circles that just keeps getting bigger. And at conferences like this, but not just at conferences like this, when we gather throughout the world in smaller groups, in larger groups, under the banner of EI, we're enabled to share our stories. We're enabled, we laugh, we cry, sometimes we're feeling frustrated, we get a chance to unload and share our own struggles. And as we do that, the relationships that tie us together become stronger. Maybe we create new relationships. But to me, this is one of the key things that EI does, is that it brings people together. You know, we hear about globalization so much in terms of money and business. Well, maybe globalization means all of us coming together in a way that gives us life and that doesn't end up being about power and control. And I think this is one of the things, the key things that EI does. And it builds solidarity among us, solidarity in our experience. I know that I came to this conference knowing a few people here. I didn't know all that many. I will leave knowing a few more, but I don't have to have met each of you individually or know all of your names to know that I stand in solidarity with you. And I think this is a key thing. We have a solidarity of purpose. We know that we are together. And this, to me, helps us to build up our own organizations. It's what helps to make the work that we do sustainable. The partnerships and the networks that have already been mentioned are really, really important. And you know, we need to keep working on nurturing those and building them, looking for allies where maybe we haven't looked before. But that ability of EI to pull us together and to help us to work together in common cause is so, so important. Another image that came to mind for me was the heat and the energy that fire generates. I think everyone here, maybe especially the women, has just a fire burning within them for justice for women around the world, women and girls, and really for all people, for our sisters, our mothers, our daughters, for oppressed people wherever they are. The poor, those who are being discriminated against for whatever reason, there's a fire that burns inside of us to see that change and to do whatever it is that we need to do to change it. And to me, events like this stoke that fire, but they can't be standalone kinds of events. It's how the whole web is woven together, the events that, and the gatherings, the getting together, the sharing of stories, the sharing of strategy, all together is what makes that sustainable. So where I see the role of EI in this is to help to focus and direct those energies, to give voice to the truth in the advocacy that we're doing externally. The Unite campaign is a really good example of that. You know, Lily mentioned the need we have for good information, something that gives us perspectives that will resonate with people who are in those positions of power and control. Talking points, information about what's going on in other parts of the world, what do we need to know about that? And then internally, what is it, the direction that will help us as organizations to hone our own advocacy, to broaden the discourses we're having within our own organizations with our members about equity, equality, social justice, and how to bring about change. Last night at City Hall, as I was thinking about all this stuff, I saw the statue of someone named Thomas Drummond. And the summary underneath the statue said that he invented a special kind of light called the Drummond light that could see through mist and fog. Well, I can't help thinking there's an awful lot of mist and fog around. And so I want to bring another image that I hold for EI, and that's the lighthouse. You can't come to Ireland without thinking there must be lighthouses around here somewhere. And, you know, EI, one of its roles, again, is to help us to navigate through that mist and fog as women, as teachers, as union leaders, and I think right now, you know, in a very concrete way, as upholders of democracy. We are struggling, we're in a struggle with forces that are very powerful, very well funded, very well connected, in a way that means to erode democracy, to you know, increase wealth for the wealthy, and the rest of us struggle to survive. These are forces that are not all that interested in equity. And I really believe we have our work cut out for us. We've seen the effects of some of this already: privatization, the global education reform movement, privatization of education, attacks on unions where, you know, you can really see they're trying to exhaust us, exhaust our resources, exhaust our resolve. It's a very deliberate kind of an attack based on power and control, and more profits, more power, more control for those who already have it. Well, EI is, to me, the lighthouse. Except that I'm, you know, the leadership that EI shows, that galvanizing force of bringing people together and then setting us so that we have a common direction. We know where it is that we're going and what we need to do. That, to me, is an incredibly valuable function of EI, but I don't think we can leave it there. I don't think there's just one lighthouse on the coast of Ireland. I think there's got to be, or a lot of them. And so each of our organizations has to be its own lighthouse. We've got to be that for our members. We've got to be that within our own countries, within our communities. We have to be able to stand and advocate for principles of justice, equality, fairness, responsibilities, each citizen taking responsibility for the common good in a way that benefits everyone. So there we are. And the sustainability question, I heard that yesterday brought up in a couple of different workshops. How do we sustain this work? We know what it is that we want to do. It can't be just an event and then, you know, a few years later another event. How do we sustain this? And there again, I think that is our responsibility in conjunction with EI. We need to communicate well. We need to stay in touch with the other member organizations of EI as well in those partnerships we establish. But we really need to tend our own fires at home. We need to be patient. We need to be vigilant. So that's where I would conclude.
Muy bien. Muchas gracias, Diane. Bueno, la Internacional de la Educación parece ser, en las palabras de las compañeras, un espacio que cumple para nosotros una multiplicidad de finalidades relevantes, ¿no? Nos encontramos ahí, en la definición que se produce en la Internacional de la Educación, frecuentemente marcos de referencia que nos ayudan a instalar cuestiones a nivel local, que nos ayudan a impulsar nuestras agendas nacionales. Encontramos un espacio donde nos agrupamos, espacios como este donde podemos ampliar nuestra perspectiva y ayudar nosotras también, a que la Internacional de la Educación tenga una mirada efectivamente internacional que integre todas las miradas en la comprensión de lo que acontece en nuestra sociedad y en la comprensión de lo que requiere el cambio. Quería, para terminar, retomar la imagen de la llama, del fuego, que traía a cuento Diane, porque estaba pensando en estos días que algunas de nuestras discusiones demuestran que la lucha no concluye nunca y que una y otra vez volvemos sobre los temas y volvemos a analizar y a discutir qué pasa y cómo hacemos para cambiarlo y a tratar de comprender mejor dónde están los elementos que hay que modificar para poder cambiar las cosas y dónde están nuestras debilidades y cómo las dificultades se suman, pero también cómo las fuerzas para el cambio pueden sumarse. Y la pelea por la igualdad de género en la sociedad, como la pelea por la igualdad en la sociedad, la igualdad en todos los aspectos de la vida social, es una pelea que no concluye. Y eso no quiere decir que sea una pelea que no avanza, es una pelea que requiere permanentemente nuestra atención y nuestro compromiso. Y entonces, para concluir, yo quería recordar que para nosotros en Argentina hay unas mujeres que son el símbolo indiscutido de la lucha, que son las Madres de Plaza de Mayo. Las Madres de Plaza de Mayo siempre nos dijeron que la única lucha que se pierde es la que se abandona. Entonces, las invito, compañeras, a no abandonar esta lucha y no abandonar tampoco la palabra. Hagamos uso de la palabra, reivindiquemos nuestra palabra y digamos con nuestra palabra por dónde y de qué modo vamos a cambiar este mundo. Muchas gracias. Tengo que hacer un aviso. Que todas las participantes están invitadas a completar un formulario de evaluación y el cuestionario UNGEI que se encuentran en el escritorio de la conferencia, el escritorio de registro de la conferencia. Una vez que completen ese formulario, allí mismo debería ser entregado. Creo que concluimos entonces este panel. Muchas gracias.